to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Dr. Tom O'Brien. I'm a lecturer at the University of York. And before I start, I've got a few technical notes. If you have any technical issues such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. And today's event is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again later. There are subtitles in this event, so to turn these on or off, use the CC Live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So that's the technical notes out of the way. So it gives me great pleasure to invite you, to welcome you to this event, and we're delivering it in collaboration with the French Embassy here in the UK. And I'm going to be introducing our panelists from UK and France, and they're going to be exploring the ways in which younger generations learn from each other how to engage with politics and what the future of citizen engagement might look like. We'd be very keen to hear from you as part of this discussion and encourage you to post questions throughout the session using the Q&A button on your screen. And we'll have ample time for that at the end. So I will now hand over to our first speaker, Professor Yves Sintomer, and he will be talking on the issue of youth activism. So I'll hand over to Yves.
Hi everybody. Thank you for the invitation and this possibility to discuss with you this quite important topic. I would like to defend 4 theses on this issue. The first one is that we have a widely spread narrative which says that young people are no more interested in politics, that they are more individualistic than the previous generations, that our society altogether is more individualistic than 2-3 decades ago. I think that this analysis is false. True is that young people especially develop other forms of politics. It's not that much professional politics. It's not that much party politics. It's not that much elections. It's not that much institutional politics. It's another kind of politics, more grassroots politics, more contestatory politics, protest, within the society, between each other, within institutions, in the streets, in the squares. It means also that we have to change our idea of what politics is. Politics is not only institutional politics, elections, party politics, professional politics. Politics is probably all actions that contest power relationships within society or defend and justify the social order. So it's a widespread dimension of our society. And the mobilization of young people in the last couple of years underlines this new conception of politics. My second point is that it is quite interesting to see the topics about which most mobilization of young people take place. I don't say all, but the main focus are racism, sexism, ecology, which are not completely new topics for sure, but topics which are much more visible now than they used to be a couple of decades ago. It means also that the social dimension, salaries, wages, and so on and so forth, are not on the front stage. In a lot of European countries, in England, in France, in other European countries, we see that the problem of money, especially in this period, with inflation and so on, the war in Ukraine, that this problem of money is very important, but the mobilization of young people mostly go in other directions. Probably these will be very important and crucial issues in this century. But we're also to say that this indicates perhaps also what kind of young people mobilize. And this is also, this leads me to my third point. The great French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu wrote in the 70s, in the last century, youth doesn't exist. He was claiming that between working class young people and middle and upper class young people, between people living in big cities and in the countryside, there was no homogeneity, and that these people were quite divided and did not form a social group. This idea has been sharply criticized, and if we look to music, to the way in which young people, fashion and so on, probably we could say that youth exists, contrary to what Bourdieu said. But perhaps for politics, what Bourdieu said in the 70s of the last century remains at least partly true. Those young people who mobilized against racism, against sexism, against the warming, the global warming. In a lot of countries, it is quite clear in France, come mostly from more educated social backgrounds, live more in big or at least middle-sized cities. And there is this tendency of the young people living in the countryside, in places which are not well integrated in the globalization process, young people who have less education, there is a tendency to mobilize less on these issues. So that there is, to some extent, a gap between within young people and not only a unified mobilization of young people. This said, we have to understand that the period is quite new and that the new generation, the youth, is altogether driving us towards another future. The mainstream narrative is that liberal democracy is under threat, that the danger of populism, both left-wing and right-wing, is always and in all countries quite important. We have to fight against it, and we have to defend liberal democracies against authoritarianism. It is true, and we see this now with the Russian aggression against Ukraine, that authoritarianism is a great danger. But we are too used to the status quo, to the form of political system that has stabilized in most West European and Northern European countries after World War II, and we don't see the changes which are going on, or at least we don't see them enough. Look at the new generation. Look at my generation and the generation of my parents. The way in which people socialized is quite different. Social networks, internet are a major factor, but not the only one. So the society has changed incredibly, and the political system has remained the same, more or less. So this is why democracy is in danger now, is under threat. The political system has not adapted itself to the evolution of society. There is a growing gap between the way in which young people socialize and the way in which the political system, the official political system, functions. In the last elections in France, only 1/3 of young people have voted in the first round of the legislative elections. And if you look at young people living in the poor suburbs, it's even less. Probably 10% of the young people have participated in the first round of the legislative elections. So we have to understand that a lot of, the majority probably, of young people think the politicians do not represent us, at least it's not satisfactory. This was also a slogan of Occupy Wall Street, of the so-called 15M in Spain, like Occupy Wall Street in Spain, the Yellow Jackets in France. There is a growing tendency to say we want to take part directly in the decision-making process, not through elected representatives who care more for their own interest, either personal or the one of their party. And this trend is everywhere in Europe. It's perhaps less strong in Northern and Central Europe, but still it's a growing tendency everywhere. And so society must change and the political system must change radically if we want to be able to integrate the energy coming from the youth, from the mobilization of young people, and transform it in a positive weapon to better our society. The problem is that young people are not those who control the political system. The problem is that young people are not those who are most visible in the decision-making process in the society, in all levels of society. But the status quo is not an option. If we don't change, I think that the scenario will be dark. So to avoid this dark scenario, we have to take into account these new mobilizations of perhaps not all the young people, but a new generation of young people. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Yves. Our next speaker is Nathan Méténier, and Nathan is a climate and environmental justice activist. So he's talking very much from the perspective of the youth. So I'll hand over to Nathan.
Thank you so much, Tom. Hi, everyone. Here, Nathan. I'm very happy to be here and also to just pose the time in our busy weeks to think also a little bit more about these issues that are extremely interesting. They're extremely important, and they also are extremely important to define and to be sure about how we approach them, because I think that then we give a lot of space for criticism and all of this. So I'm very happy to be here. So I very much agree in the sense that, you know, kind of the next generation or young people in general, there's not a single very clear category. Of course, there is, well, all young people, and then there's like any kind of generation, a part that's very active, that can be, you know, focusing on certain causes and certain issues. And of course, we can't generalize. I agree. The students, privileged, young workers, others who are unemployed, too many, in my opinion. And of course, another dimension, which is the North-South divide, which is being, of course, criticized more and more because there are extremely wealthy and privileged young people everywhere in the world, even in the global South, and extremely poor young people in the global North as well. And of course, all of this brings into question the kind of issues of legitimacy, diversity, and eventually democracy. But also I wanted to kind of come back on also the kind of, I guess, youth climate movements, because I think it's also one of the kind of, good example of how strong and important youth climate kind of, youth movements have become really strong and kind of led also to various different changes. For example, I'm sitting in an advisory group of the UN Secretary General to advise him on his climate environmental work in general. And that is, you know, something that was very much coming after years of mobilization from young people. But it's a fact, right? the kind of youth climate justice, youth climate movement strikes, Fridays for Future, Youth for Climate, they took some very different shapes in countries, are the largest single environmental movement in history. So not just for youth, but also for environment and climate movement. So this is really important because it also kind of set a precedent, right, of having millions and millions of young people striking in the street simultaneously everywhere in the world, and of course mostly in the global north, but also in the global south, and I'll come back a little bit on this as well. But of course the kind of existing movements also, the kind of youth climate movement existed much before, and I think it's always also very interesting to think also about those kind of dynamics. Of course the strikes have been really important here in the UK. Of course the civil disobedience movement made of young people mostly, with Extinction Rebellion and others, have been really strong, a little bit less in other countries, I'd say. But also I think a kind of bigger movements where a lot of different elites that are not doing activism work and that are not involved in youth, NGOs or networks or activist groups, are more and more questioning the kind of, career path of earning money and then just not focusing so much on what you're actually doing, maybe fossil fuels or kind of fostering social injustices within the working place. But I think what's so interesting when we think about the next generation and what has happened in the past years is the kind of intersectionality dimension. So if I can say it, this is a big word, and I know sometimes it can be also a bit scary, but I do think this is this single word that is the most helpful to understand what's going on and what's happening. We see various different kind of groups, and of course, the kind of youth climate movement was very strong in 2018, 2019, saying, listen to the science. We need to, stay under 1.5 degree of increase of global temperature. But then the kind of Black Lives Matter, which was also, very kind of youth-led, started in the US, maybe a little bit more than the youth climate movement, which started in Europe, those kind of issues of racism and all of this. And I think that mostly in general, we can see that in the past 10 years, but maybe even more in the 5 to 10 years, and in the last 2 years, there is this kind of convergence of various different fights. And actually, a lot of different activists and environmental and climate movements have been pushing very hard to take into account the social justice dimension and, kind of linking that to also broader systemic issues. And same, we've seen also Black Lives Matter or kind of anti-colonial groups also, participating in kind of climate events and environmental justice issues. And that also brings another dimension to this question, because of course the kind of topic of this conference is next generation citizen, but of course what about non-citizen, right? And it's also very, very interesting to think about that this week with what's going on in the UK and the kind of whole Rwanda refugee conversation. But of course those movements have been also extremely welcoming of the non-citizens, so the refugees and others that live kind of also on the boundaries of society. And then this brings us to kind of democracy and how I think that kind of youth climate justice movements, how I see them approach issues of democracy, and also, of course, the question of, do we need to save democracy, what democracy means, and all of this. And I think actually this is very interesting, because as kind of youth climate justice movements, we are everywhere in the world. We're not just in the UK, in France, in the US, but we're also, in Georgia, in Azerbaijan, in Ghana, in Brazil, and so on. And what's so interesting is that many of those countries are, either illiberal democracies or also authoritarian governments. I'm just coming back from Turkey, which, is also a very tricky political situation right now. Well, first, I think that, when it comes to democracy, it's also the issue that our democracies, in the sense that we've conceived them and we're still conceiving them today, the kind of liberal democracy, as it was just talked about before, are failing completely to bring about social justice. There has never been as many wealthy people than today, and especially before now after the pandemic. Education is extremely expensive. Health safety is also kind of failing. So there's also kind of a situation where we see that our democracies are not managing in the way that maybe they've done before to bring about social justice and equality, and most importantly, equity, right? Also bringing those who are the most marginalized to the level of the rest. And the other thing, which also we've been criticizing a lot, is that they are failing to be inclusive. Almost all our policymakers are 40, 50, 60, they're often white, they're very often also heterosexual. So they represent also this norm that have been in power and that has maintained this kind of system, which, you know, also many of these politicians didn't really focus on, you know, issues of systemic racism, LGBTQ plus communities inclusion, and also promoting refugees friendly policies. But after having said all of that, and kind of also, you know, showing a bit of the dark things that's going on, I think that young people are innovating, and I think that's really interesting. I'm part of a network, Youth and Environment Europe, so we are a network of around 42 youth-led climate justice, environmental justice groups, mostly based also in Central Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. So it's not a Western European kind of driven network. And the work we're trying to do is also to showcase those activists who are doing amazing work in, you know, illiberal democracies, in communities that are, you know, historically discriminated, BIPOC people, BAM here, to use the kind of acronym that we use here in the UK, but also others, right? There is in the UK also amazing group, UK Youth Climate, Youth for Climate is doing amazing things. And I think that what we need now to kind of focus to change is, well, of course, first to upskill workers and young people with green skills to make sure that, you know, we are ready to invest and to spend more time in the just and green transition, which, you know, represent millions of jobs if we really invest rightly into it, but also grow the next generation of young leaders, and making sure that those young leaders that will become, you know, leaders of our governments, institutions at the local, national, regional, international level come from this diversity that we need, but also keep putting pressure and asking for system change. We are not just trying to fix a broken system, we're trying to change it, and this is extremely important. And to do this, we need to keep voicing the injustices that are going on. And then lastly, and I think for me, at least in my activism, I'm so sorry, I'm very sweaty because it's extremely warm in London right now. But also lastly, and it's really important, is bringing more empathy and kindness in the work we do. And having been an activist for now 7 years, I've always been struck by how much empathy and kindness there is also in this very big family. So for me, change can only happen with young people for sure, but also by also, you know, changing and listening to young people to change our democracies. Yeah, thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nathan. That was fascinating. Lots to think about there. And our final speaker today is Dr. Helen Sunderland, and Helen is a historian of political culture, education, and childhood in modern Britain. So I'll hand over to Helen.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be part of this panel today. So thank you so much for the invitation and for you all for coming along. I'd like you to picture the scene. Hundreds of school children walk out of their classroom in protest of a profound injustice. They march through the streets, carrying banners and shouting their demands. News travels fast. A strike starts in one part of the UK, and then it inspires others in different towns and cities. Soon a whole wave of school strikes has gripped the nation. No, I'm not talking about school strikes for climate that have hit headlines in recent years. I'm not even talking about the protests against corporal punishment organised by the Pupil-Led Schools Action Union in the 1970s. Instead, turn the clock back even further to 1889, when pupils from schools across the country walked out of lessons to demand an end to the cane, free primary education for everyone, and somewhat more idealistically, an end to homework. School strikes have a long history, as does youth activism. But as I'll talk about this evening, young people's involvement in participatory forms of democracy has also evolved over the last 150 years. I want to share some thoughts about how I think a historical perspective can help us to unpack the important questions that we're discussing this evening. If we want to know how young people are shaping the future of democracy, what can we learn by looking at the past? Of course, today's context is very different to 1889. There are new global injustices to protest. There's new technology to facilitate global political movements. But how far is the story of youth citizenship one of continuity? Many of the tactics are similar. Young people are still battling the same prejudices to get their voices heard. The history of youth activism shows us that the same ageist assumptions are still being used to discredit young citizens. The varied media and political responses to today's youth activists throw out many of the same issues that I grapple with in my research on children's politics 150 years ago. Responses move between two extremes. Sometimes young activists are celebrated. They have the moral authority that adults embedded in an exploitative system lack. So they represent a glimmer of hope for the future of the planet and for just and redistributive political systems. Or on the other hand, these young activists are dangerous and they're subversive. They're hypocritically condemning a system in which they're already complicit. They're rebelling against adults who know better. These conflicting perspectives map onto two dominant models of childhood that have a long history. In the 19th century West, attitudes towards children were polarized. There was a romantic ideal of innate childhood innocence, but there was also an evangelical, a religiously influenced model that argued that children's natural tendency for disobedience needed to be overcome. And this tension has proved remarkably enduring. It continues to inform the different responses to youth politics that we see today. Bound up in the idealization of the young activist are age-based prejudices about what a child should look like and how a child should act. Where do we draw the line between the child or youth citizen in waiting and the quote unquote real adult citizen? So one question I have for the other panelists is how far young people's ability to shape democracy's future is limited by the assumptions that adults place on them. But I think our debates about youth citizenship sometimes can pay a bit too much attention to activism. There's a rich history of young people's involvement in and education for democracy that we can bring to our discussion this evening. Young people have long been involved in shaping democracy. I want to tell you a story about how Helen Wilkinson, one of the first female MPs for the Labour Party elected in 1924, came into politics. In 1908, Ellen was 16 and she attended a school for trainee primary teachers in Manchester. Her school announced that there would be a mock parliamentary election. Boys took on the roles of candidates for the two main political parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals. But Ellen wanted to be involved. The head boy gave in, but only on the condition that she got the less popular role of the socialist candidate. Ellen took this in her stride, learning all she could about socialist ideas. When polling day came, surprisingly, she won. Word of Ellen's unexpected election victory spread quickly in Manchester's socialist circles. She was invited to speak at socialist meetings and she threw herself into local political organisation. In her autobiography, Ellen looked back to this event as a formative moment in her political development. This is a great example of how school politics can lead into a political career, but it also shows us a wider political landscape that took place in schools over 100 years ago. Mock elections were by no means a universal experience, but they did take place in a number of institutions, mostly in middle-class secondary schools, but I found a few elementary teachers who introduced their working class pupils to electoral politics in this way as well. School pupils reenacted elections carefully. They stood as candidates and they gave speeches. They decorated their schools with election posters, and most importantly, they cast their ballot. Through mock elections, young people were active participants in democratic activity, even though they were formally excluded from the democratic process. And schools today still kind of carry on these mock election activities. And I think mock elections raise important questions about whether young citizens should work within or outside of existing political structures. These historical mock elections were partly training for future adult citizenship, but elections like Ellen Wilkinson's took place years before women and even all men had the parliamentary vote. So they were subversive. They were making a political statement. I think it's striking that this training took place at all. In their elections, school children imitated adult political processes carefully. This was a way for them to claim political legitimacy. Following electoral process showed that they were politically mature and competent. It showed that they were equipped for the vote. But the risk of working within existing models is that youth politics then perpetuates the structural issues that beset our current democratic systems. Is it really possible for young people to change systems from within them? Another forum for youth politics that I look at in my research in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are school mock parliaments. In these events, school pupils recreated the House of Commons in Westminster in their own classrooms. These started around 1880, first in secondary schools, but then they emerged in primary schools as well. Mock parliaments imitated parliamentary process. A teacher oversaw the whole thing as speaker, and the pupils played the roles of different MPs. Some debates were about school life, others imitated key debates going through the real House of Commons, like women's suffrage and abolishing the House of Lords. Schoolgirls' parliaments are especially interesting, I think. Rather than spending endless hours debating in Westminster's confrontational style, girls instead ran very efficient parliaments. They passed bills on controversial issues within a single sitting. And some of this was obviously necessary in how they were recreating parliament in school. But the girls were also making a political point in doing this. At a time when women still didn't have the vote, they were showing that they were perfectly well qualified for it. What's more, they were suggesting that women could run parliament much more efficiently than men. It's commonplace now, as the others have mentioned, to talk about a democracy in crisis. There are concerns about voter apathy, misinformation, corruption. Debates rage over 18 as a very arbitrary age marker of full citizenship. But I've tried to show something about how young people have always been at the heart of experiments to rethink or revitalize democracy. They were shaping democracy from a place of even greater exclusion from the political system, even as it was emerging. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. It was fascinating. It's fascinating to get it's always fascinating to get historical perspective to push us to think further back. So if I can ask our other two panelists to join us. Thank you. So we've got a little bit of time now for a bit of a discussion. If I can ask, if you're in the audience and you have any questions, please just pop them in the Q&A. Click the button. We'll be setting aside some time to discuss those. So please do take that opportunity. So I guess my first point really is, I guess, to kick off our little discussion is, Helen, you mentioned the role of gender. That was an important part of your talk. So I was wondering if I could possibly pass to Yves and Nathan, ask them what role, building on what Helen's had to say, what role does gender play in your understandings of youth activism?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Dom. I think it's a really important question and very dear to me because we are a network led by young people, but actually we're a network mostly majoritarily a network led by young women, and I think 95% of youth and environment Europe is led by women. So there is definitely a kind of also, you know, something that you see in the youth climate movement, that many women are involved, and also I have so many examples also in the global south. But another thing also which I think is really important is how we are contributing to rethinking what, you know, gender means, and how important it is based on our conversations and activism. I mean, one of the big thing I was talking about before, right, is intersectionality. And I think intersectionality also really came from understanding that all of us were, kind of, mostly coming from the LGBTQ plus movement, and kind of also embodying those different kind of understanding of what, sexuality and gender means. And of course, it's the same as well in terms of understanding how, gendering our societies and our communities are also been a way to oppress us, right? And this is very true, for example, with indigenous communities. Many, for example, in the US, kind of the binary between women and men has been used as a way to also, dominate and exploit people, and kind of, remove some kind of other practices that were existing before. So I think it really comes at the heart of also not just what we are promoting in many ways, at least for, big youth climate justice movements. I'm not saying all of them, but I think it's very true. But we're also very much embodying those new perspectives on gender, if I can say. Yeah.
Great. Yves, Helen, I know you covered this already, but I just wondered if you had anything further to add, because it's a fascinating area, the way in which you presented it.
Yeah, perhaps I have two questions, one for Nathan and one for Helen. For Nathan, I really think that you are right when you say that intersectionality is a growing tendency, especially among young people. It's quite interesting to see that all these new topics, and you are right that it's not only sexism, but gender in general, racism, ecology are very often coupled, and that something new is coming in this direction. Although there are limits, and perhaps you present a true rosa scenario about it. A friend of mine, who is one of the leader of, intellectual leader of Extinction Rebellion, told me that when you put too much racism topics within local circles in Extinction Rebellion, you lose some people. So you can speak a bit about it, but not that much. I take another example in France. In France, about 42% of young people in the first round of the legislative elections, of those young people who voted for the Left Alliance, which basically defends intersectionality perspective. But 18% voted for Le Pen, only 13% for Macron's presidential majority. But when you take the working class, 45% voted for Le Pen on the far right. And they are not in favor of intersectionality. It's quite the opposite. And probably the young people of the working class didn't vote. So don't you think that there is also a gap within young people between a growing tendency towards intersectional struggles and another part which refuses this evolution? And for Helen, my question would be a bit different. I can't tell for England, but I think that for France, the big difference was, say, the decades after World War II, when women and men had the possibility to vote, and when you had mass political parties, which made it possible for young people to mobilize and to be integrated in party politics. I mean, in 52 in England, 4 million people were party members. Now it's a bit more than 500,000. Something similar at a much lower level was also true in France. When I'm teaching both in France, in Italy, sometimes in Germany, in Greece, when I ask my students, 100 students, do you trust politicians? Do you trust the political system? 90 among 100 say no. In Greece, when I asked this a couple of years ago in front of 300 students, they just laughed. It was a stupid question. How could you trust the political system? The only exception I know is in Switzerland, because in Switzerland, when I first asked this question, when I first gave classes there, on 100 students, 90 said yes, and I thought they didn't understand me. So I asked them again. No, they did understand, are satisfied by the political system, much less by the party, but the political system. Federalism and direct democracy are crucial for this. So I think that don't you, to some extent, underestimate the moment after World War II, perhaps before in England with the Labour, I don't know, in which it was possible to integrate young people into official politics, and that now the panorama has changed so much that perhaps voting is not the most important anymore.
I don't know, I'm happy to react to the first one. Maybe Helen, you want to start and I'll answer the other one.
Yeah, no, I can definitely kick off. Thank you. Yeah, really important questions. I guess some of this is, you know, the period of history I specialise in, late 19th, early 20th century. I guess the moment in England of equal suffrage comes earlier, so it's 1928, and some women first get the vote in 1918. So I think I'm interested in kind of looking at a history where young people were actually part of figuring out what that looked like. There was a whole load of anxiety about giving women the vote and giving all working men the vote. And I'm interested in kind of how voting at that time kind of seemed a really important part of the state trying to kind of control what democratic citizenship would look like. And I guess, I think you're right, maybe kind of I focus a lot on voting. I think it's interesting that kind of the institutional training for youth citizenship still kind of fixates on that. So kind of people's exposure to kind of political education in schools, if it happens at all, they might still do a mock election, or they'll kind of think about parliament and politics. So there's going back to that sense of kind of what actually needs to shift to bring the system in line with kind of maybe where young people are at in terms of kind of the excitement and energy. There's something kind of in how they're still being educated for a very kind of traditional system. But I still think it's interesting kind of how young people can still kind of work within that. So, you know, it's only kind of 20 years since the UK and different kind of constituent parts of it have got youth parliaments, and that's still kind of a really vibrant and valuable part of where young people find having a voice. And I'd be fascinated actually, Nathan, to hear from your perspective about, you know, you were mobilizing, the youth movement was mobilizing for years just to get a seat around the table and to get the UN Secretary General to kind of set up something. So I feel like there's still something important about having kind of institutional representation. And I think we can't kind of set, you know, the two need to be entwined, I guess, kind of what I'm talking about, the kind of institutions, and I guess what the position you're both coming from, more from the kind of activist perspective, like, is there a way to kind of bring the two together? Because ultimately we're trying to bring the energy from the activist movements to change the system. And it's kind of quite at what point we bring those into dialogue, which is tricky, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, for sure, first, well, you know, as anything, we are an ecosystem, right? Like, there's not a single thing as the youth. And if there's anything I say today, is that there's not a single thing as the youth climate movement. So I think that's also this kind of different dynamics with ecosystems. And I do believe that the change will come from the grassroots and will come with, you know, kind of marginalized communities and those on the ground being the most empowered. But I do believe there is also a big part to be played by people that, you know, are focusing much more on like institutions and so on. For what it is for me, I'm very much of a grassroots activist. I focus and spend my weeks trying to find resources for grassroots movements on the ground, pushing, you know, governments or local governments, or also, you know, private industries to change, and also, you know, kind of voicing what's not working. And I do believe that change will happen. And then the kind of sitting on this advisory board is yeah, kind of interesting, but I don't think change is really happening there. And yeah, just coming back on the intersectionality, I think it's really important. I think what the kind of intersectionality thinking really invites us to do, and it's again an activist perspective. I'm not a researcher, and I don't pretend to be one, but it's really looking at all those different issues, right? Like racism and colonialism, if we can say they're also very much interlinked, climate crisis and climate change, biodiversity loss, for example, LGBTQI plus discrimination, and then thinking, what is the cause of all of this? Well, again, it's an exploitative, violent, capitalist system, and which is, I think, today even more. We can see it even more than in the past, because we can see that there's never been such inequalities. I mean, I don't know how we can tolerate to have a couple of people earning, 70, 80, 90% of our research, of our wealth. It's insane that people like Elon Musk can, earn 60, 70, 80 billion. So I think that the core of the problem is very much the system. And so this kind of thinking around intersectionality invites us to think, oh, well, maybe the cause is the same. And I think then you look at who, and then when you look at who and who has the power today and has had the power for 300-400 years, and who also still have the power today, both in the private sector and the public sector. Well, again, it's white male in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, which mostly are also very much of the norm, which means also that by their gender or their sexuality, they're male cis, and that doesn't mean that all men white cis are bad. Of course not, but it's a trend, and we should be questioning why this is the case. And so therefore, what I think is so interesting with this thinking around intersectionality is that it brings us together. And honestly, I am absolutely just interested in what brings us together to kind of, shape this society and bring about maybe different democracies and better democracies, which are maybe not, completely relying on an economic capitalist liberal system. And then, you can take all these issues I was talking about before, racism and colonialism, well, bring the equity part, and for that we need also stronger democracies, and for more equity then maybe kind of this positive discrimination but made on a much bigger scale. Climate crisis, well, if there's one space where we need to hear those people that have been historically marginalized, well, it's this one, because they are the one facing more the effect. And that's true in the global south right now, right? But it's also true in our old great democracies, in London, who is the most, or in Paris, who is the most impacted? Well, is those living around the highways, and they get much more pollution, and often these people are either people of color, or sometimes also working class. So for me, this kind of intersectionality thinking is really very much a tool to use, if I can say that, to bring about change and come together and see that whatever you're fighting against, actually we can fight together, because it's the same goal at the end. And what I've seen the most exciting in my activism is I've seen how the youth climate movement started this very kind of listen to the science, the most important is climate action, and then thinking, well, climate action is not always positive, right? Like if you build renewable energy on lands that are owned by indigenous people or local people, that doesn't work, and that doesn't bring, a fair transition. And I think the fair part of the green and green transition really came stronger, and I think that's the recipe for change.
Great, thanks, Nathan. So we could talk about this for all day, but I'm conscious that we do have audience members, so I'm going to pass over to the questions, and I'll read through a couple if we can just share your thoughts on those briefly. So we have a question from Julian from University of Southern California, asking what role do you see speculative fiction, popular culture, and fandom as factors in youth activism? Open that up to anyone.
Perhaps not the best one to answer this question. I have the feeling that it's important, but it's a feeling. I have no real skill to respond about it. Perhaps somebody in the audience could, or in the panel.
I can throw in a slightly kind of left field historical kind of example of this. I guess sort of this is another place where we can maybe challenge our sense that kind of this is something that has just emerged, you know, in the last sort of 10 years or so with kind of technological change and social media and that sort of thing. In my research, I was looking at the Boy's Own paper, which is like the most best-selling magazine for kind of teenagers, mostly kind of upper working middle class boys in the late 19th century. And there's a really wonderful cartoon that's all about this kind of fictional mock election that takes place in a boys' school. And it literally goes through like each little kind of cartoon kind of box shows the different kind of moments of it, and they're messing around, and there's like an election fight that takes place in this kind of boys' public school. But I think it's really fascinating for thinking about how all these ideas about how kind of young people are incorporating politics into kind of, yeah, their social lives at school, into kind of the way they're playing with each other. You know, it might not be that everyone had a chance to actually kind of do a mock election, but, you know, the kind of, yeah, hundreds of thousands of readers of the Boy's Own paper would have seen this cartoon and kind of engaged with it in some sense. So I think kind of there is an important thing to be said about kind of the sort of discourse, or the kind of, yeah, the sort of messages that get through into kind of popular culture, and kind of, yeah, how to kind of, I guess, sort of mobilize them in some way for good, rather than kind of seeing them sort of as a backdrop. But I think, yeah, kind of youth politics is always going to kind of enter into popular culture in really interesting ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess we could think about youth activists effectively constructing their idea of what the future, what they want the future to look like. So that's my little bit there. And I'm conscious of the questions, so I do want to have a go through a few. So a question from Etta, who was really interested in what Nathan was saying about those that have no political voice, for example, refugees, and what ramifications this may have on the future direction of society. What does it mean that certain groups, youth groups, don't have a voice within society?
Yeah, I'm happy to react very quickly. I mean, I think, you know, in this whole conversation around, you know, changing and bettering our democracies in radical ways, it's also very, very important, yeah, to rethink the way we're doing integration, to have policies that are much more refugees friendly and that are welcome. And of course, this is again like one of the biggest hypocrisy, but there's so many. But well, we need refugees, and any kind of modern democracies know that, and all the policymakers know that. So it's a very, yeah, hypocritical thing. And I think another thing which is really, really important is, and that comes back also to the whole kind of colonial, anti-colonial, post-colonial debate, right? What kind of resources are you actually bringing to communities and other countries that are, you know, facing issues that lead to these migration waves? And I think in the context of the climate crisis, it's extremely important. We have a commitment of $100 billion that needs to come from the wealthiest countries in the global north and to go to the global south countries that need it the most, both for their climate mitigation strategies, so to get rid of the greenhouse gas emissions that they are producing in their developing practices, but also climate adaptation, right? Like, how do we prepare the country to get ready for this increasing kind of climate hazards and all of this? And you know, the kind of global north countries, the G7 and so on, are saying, well, you know, we're almost 80 to 90% of reaching that goal. And then global south countries, and especially those members of the G77, so like kind of the main, like the least developed and the islands, are saying, well, actually what we're receiving is not even 11% of that 100 billion commitment. And why? Because the global north are saying, yeah, but we're giving, but you know, through bilateral agreements, through development banks, where you're maintaining this neo-colonial relationship where, you know, the UK is giving funding to countries in Africa, but in exchange, you need to use British company. How is that helping countries in any way? So there are also those huge issues that, you know, comes back to finance help. And that's where I really think that we need to stop being hypocritical, because we are, and that's not helping us. If we take the example of the refugees crisis, for example, and the one who are coming. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we've got a couple more questions. I'm going to roll them in together because I think they do speak to each other. And I'm going to direct this towards Yves. And we've got a question here about when such a high, from Edith, from such a high percentage of adults have so little faith or trust in the political system, how do we begin to help young people feel they have something to contribute? And then if I build on the other two questions as well, does that mean young people see democracy as worth defending? And your point on Le Pen, did the success of Marine Le Pen in the first round of the presidential election lead to more young people coming out to vote? So I've kind of rolled them all together into one big mess for you to chew over.
Well, I think that we have to change the system if we want young people to be active in it and to find it legitimate. And when you ask young people in most European countries, they do not refuse democracy, but at least in the Western and northern countries, in Eastern Europe, it's probably different. In the global South, it's again another story. I won't speak about it. But if we keep on with Western and Northern and Central Europe, young people don't say that they oppose democracy, but they do say that they want another kind of democracy because they don't feel represented by the kind of democracy which is functioning now. So we have to go much beyond party politics, much beyond elections, and invent new modes of participatory and direct and deliberative democracy if we want to change these relationships and to reduce the gap between young people and official politics. In France, young people voted more during the presidential election, and this is as usual, because in France, the presidential elections are more important than the legislative elections, and because it's easier to identify with one charismatic political leader, a bit on the right, on the left, on the far right, on the far left, or in the center. And part of the young people mobilized and voted more in order to avoid Le Pen president. But we don't have to underestimate the number of young people, especially from the working class, who mobilized for Marine Le Pen. It was a huge proportion, not the majority, but at least a third or 40%. So, well, again, there is not only one use, there are several use, and I think that we have to take this into account, and again, it is my a bit question to Nathan. When I listen to what you say, and when I listen to the young activists now, on the one hand, I say, at last, what I was defending quite alone when I was 15 years old is going on. But
Yves,
what about the other ones?
I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to, we're almost out of time. Thank you so much, though. I want to say quickly, because I've left a little bit long, thank you to Helen, Nathan, and Yves for a fascinating talk. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June. And you'll be contacted by email when the video is available for review. And I would also thank the French Embassy for their support. And if you enjoyed this event, you may also be interested in, sorry, the message jumped. Lost it. Europe and the Radical Right. So thank you very much. We're out of time, and thank you for a fascinating, stimulating talk.